Alright, so hello one and all, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei episode review where I'll be going over the manga and light novel to talk about everything that the anime covered and everything that it skipped. And today we are going to be talking about episode 21 to start off, Turning Point 2. So yes, we are finally at the second of an amount of turning points, which I'm not going to reveal how many there are. But we are at 2. This is a big one. I mean, all of them are pretty big, except for the last one, I'm not going to lie. That one's kind of lame. But the other turning points, all of them they're big. So let's just jump into this. So we start off with Dead End in a carriage as they reach the Red Worm's lower jaw, and Rudy starts to mention that it's already been 3 years since they've met Ruijerd, and it's all thanks to him that they've returned to Asura. But just then, as they walk, the dragons flying in the sky start to scream and fly away in fear. And just then, Rudius notices a woman, Nanahoshi, as Eris mentions that she has never seen black hair in this world before. Where blue and red, I guess, can be natural colors, black really isn't, but here it is. It's just rare, I guess. And then Rudius then notices, more importantly, Orsted as he walks past them. But as he does, Orsted notices Ruijerd above being a super and then goes, "Oh, I know that face, you're Ruijerd Superdia. I didn't recognize you without the hair." Orsted then asks why they're here, and Rudius asks Ruijerd if he knows Orsted. And then he looks over to him and sees that he is just petrified with fear. The man looks like he's about to piss his pants, maybe even shit and cum. And Orsted also recognizes Eris, but she too is also afraid. For some reason, Ruijerd doesn't know Orsted despite the fact that Orsted knows him. But Orsted, for some reason, doesn't recognize Rudius. And looking at him with his demonic eye, Rudius notices that Orsted almost looks like Hitogami, all blurry and out of focus. But I mean, it's just because of the different potential futures, but for some reason he related him to Hitogami. And Orsted is like, "Oh, man, what a strange place to meet. But as long as you're fine, it shouldn't matter." And Nanahoshi's like, "So this whole thing's alright?" He's like, "Well, nothing we can do about it. He'll find out, eventually." And I believe they're talking to specifically Ruijerd here. So Ruijerd will find out something eventually. But Rudius then stops Orsted from leaving, and he finds out that Rudius is Paul's son, despite the fact that he should only have 2 daughters. And he also introduces himself as Orsted and says that he hasn't met Ruijerd and Eris yet. But then he looks at Rudius deep in the eyes and notices how he doesn't turn his head from Orsted. And Rudius is like, "Oh, dude, man, I would love to look away from you right now. I'm not gonna lie." But again, Orsted approaches the carriage a little bit and Ruijerd tells him to not get any closer. And Orsted's like, yeah, I get it. But to put it another way, Rudius, you're not afraid of me like those two are, right? Strange. Perhaps it's because... No, that's not it. I have no memory of you. And Orsted then mentions Hitogami, and Rudius thinks that Orsted also gets visions of Hitogami like he does as well, and then the fight breaks out. Ruijerd gets literally just one tap this time, and Orsted calls Rudius a messenger for Hitogami. And Eris jumps in and is about to hit Orsted, but then he says, "Quintessence. Flow." Quintessence is the 5th and highest element in ancient and medieval philosophy that permeates all nature and is the substance composing the celestial bodies. No idea what he did to her, but he philosophically flowed her ass. And she just went flying. And so I think that's why the anime just didn't show what he did to her, because I don't think anybody did. But Orsted then compliments her, saying that her swordsmanship has improved and that she always showed promise, but she was no master. Orsted then blasts the shit out of Rudius's chest, collapsing both of his lungs, and he says that the best way to defeat a magician is to crush their lungs. And Rudius then fires a stone cannon. Orsted sticks his hand out and he tanks the shot. He looks at his hand to find that it's bleeding, and he's surprised that such magic, such basic beginner tier magic, can even hurt him. And he wonders why Rudius doesn't just heal his lungs since he's a silent spellcaster. But just as Rudius tries to shoot a fireball, Orsted shuts that shit down and uses disturb magic to seal his right hand. And then a bunch of chains come flying out from somewhere and wrap around Rudius's wrists. But Rudius then sees Eris trying to get up, but he doesn't really want her to. He wants her to just sit down because she's hurt. And so then Rudius uses some kind of wind magic in his left hand before Orsted snaps his fingers and some kind of dragon statue door rises from the ground as the gates open, and it sucks Rudius' mana away from him, draining him completely. He calls it the Gate of Dragon's Past, unlike it being called the Front Worm Gate in the anime and light novels. However, just as it does in the anime, it cracks a bit as it tries to absorb Rudius' mana. And Orsted walks over to Rudius, picks him up by the head, and pierces his body with his other hand. Eris starts to cry and scream, crawling over to him, and she says, "Heavenly, healing, heal. What do I do? The blood won't stop." And Nanahoshi looks down at her as Orsted apologizes while Eris cries out for anybody to save Rudius. She hugs him, crying out as Orsted walks away, but Nanahoshi stays. She says that something is bothering her, and then we cut to Rudius in the void. He sinks deeper and deeper into a void, thinking about his life. He was so close to going back home. Eris, Ruijerd, are they okay? He apologizes to Paul for not being able to find all of his family, and he wonders if he ever reunited with Lily and Aisha, and he hopes that Zenith is okay, and that Aisha and Norm will grow up and get along. And his dream with living with everybody, Sylphie, Roxy, and Eris, it's all gone. And then we see Hitogami, but just as fast as he came, he left, because now we see Rudius with Eris over top of him. Eris starts to cry as Rudius, thinking like this is just part of the process of dying, apologizes to Eris that he couldn't bring her back home. He had died without being able to fulfill his promise. And Eris is like, dying? What are you talking about? And he's like, oh, come on, Eris, you don't have to sugarcoat it. I can't live with a hole in my... Oh, shit, I'm fixed. And Eris explains that Nanahoshi thought that it'd be better if Rudius lived. And Eris crawled over to them, begging them with her head on the ground as Orsted sighs. He's like, fine, I'll heal him. And then he puts his hand over Rudius' chest and heals him completely. Rudius is like super confused about the situation, but then he shoots up and is like, oh my god, are you okay? What about Ruijerd? And Eris gets mad at him and it's like, I can't believe you. You're asking us if we're okay? And he's like, well, yeah, you were like hurt. You were thrown against a wall and Ruijerd was like one-tapped. But Eris reminds him that he was more hurt than anybody. Like, you know, with the hole in his chest, kind of. But Rudius apologizes to her as Eris brings her hand to his face and places it on his cheek. And she tells him that he needs to take care of himself more. And then she pulls him in and gives him a good old smooch. And she starts to tear up and says that she was so worried about losing him. And then Rudius passes out from a serious nosebleed and she kind of freaks out a bit. But they kissed. It's so cool. I like it. I watched episode 1 of the anime when it came out, and then I instantly caught up on the manga because I couldn't wait anymore. And then after that, I'm like, no, I need more Mushoku Tensei. Like, my itch hasn't been fixed. And then I read the light novel, and I'm like, I can't wait for this kissing scene. I can't wait for the kiss scene. And then it never happened. This is a manga-only thing, and it's like, god damn it. It's such a nice scene. But anyway, Rudius is back in the void, and he's like, oh, my first kiss, and I fainted. Stay classy, me. I mean, I couldn't help it though, right? I've never kissed a girl in my past life. I am a professional grade virgin. Don't take that out of context. That's Rudius speaking, not me. And as Rudius thinks all this, Hitogami laughs at him. And Rudius goes like, I wouldn't have been in this mess at all if it weren't for your name. And Rudius wonders how he's ever going to be able to look Eris in the eyes after he wakes up. But then, he does. And now he is face to face with a demon. And so that is the manga. Although I will say again, the aftermath scene of, after the fight, the whole kissing thing, I really like that a lot more in the manga than the anime and light novel. Because, especially in the anime, because the scene kind of just felt a little weird, I think. It was just presented kind of awkwardly. They were kind of just like, oh, you're safe, that's good. Eris, Rudius, and he places a hand on the shoulder and it's like, good job on not dying. I don't know, it's kind of weird. It was a little awkward. So I think the kiss really would have made things a little bit better. But anyway, moving on to the light novel. Dead End left the Sharon Kingdom and traveled far westward, heading for the Asura Kingdom. The country roads were flat and the weather was pleasantly warm, and on either side of the highway were fields of grass as far as the eye could see. And directly ahead of them was a faint outline of the Red Worm Mountains, with red worm dragons flying circles above it. It was a pretty nice journey. However, every now and then they would get jumped by bandits who would absolutely get their shit rocked each and every time. And that is the difference between the central continent and the demon continent. You would never see arrogant folks like this and try and jump people. However, in return, you would see a bunch of monsters on your trail. So I guess this is better, dealing with some weak humans versus powerful monsters. But the fact that people could just do as they pleased is proof of how peaceful this region was. If they traveled just a little bit more north, there was a jumble of smaller countries duking it out. This is the conflict zone. And in reality, this conflict was probably the cause of the rising number of bandits in this area. But the Red Worm Mountains were a large mountain range that stretched far across the central continent and split it up into 3 parts, all with red worms residing in the mountains. They were fearsome creatures, and even worse, they had a special ability, very similar to the Superds, that allowed them to detect any living creature within the area. However, where the Superds used magic to do that, with the red worms, it was just the fact that their senses were that good. Even things like small dogs weren't even safe, and it didn't matter how weak their opponent was, the worms would swarm together as a pack and devour it, bones and all. If you trespassed on their turf, you died. That was just common knowledge in this world. And there were many different types of dragons in this world, and each and every one of them were at A ranked or higher. Among them, the red worms were the most powerful. A single one was a low S rank tier, but they always came in groups and had vast territories. Since they decided that mountains were their home, it became known as the Red Worm Mountains, and it became a symbol of death. But why live in the mountains? Well, it's because of their one weakness. They were terrible flyers and could not take flight without jumping off of a cliff or running down a long slope. Although the central continent had tall mountains, the land itself was mostly occupied by a bunch of flat plains and forests, so that's why they reside in the mountains. It'd be pretty unlucky for someone living on the plains to be attacked by a red worm. Unlikely though, not impossible. There would be the occasional idiot amongst the horde that would get caught up in some winds or something and fall into the plains. The High King that falls from the heavens loses its power, or so they say anyway, but these kings, they never drop their crown. If one of them fell into a village, it would be gone in an instant. The soldiers and adventurers would be called in to deal with it. These were S-ranked missions, but even still, parties of about 10 people would be formed to lure the worm into a trap, making it somewhat easier to hunt. Dragon meat and bones were top quality materials to make armor with, and their skin was highly valued as a work of art. But it wasn't just those parts of the body that held value. The entire body of a worm could be utilized for something or other. And although the prize money was distributed amongst a large party, each member would still have enough money to live very well off for a year. To be specific, one red worm was worth about 100 gold pieces. And since it's been, I believe, like episode 12 since I had to show you the world's currencies, here they are for reference. Now, I assume we're talking about Asuran gold coins, not Mills' gold coins, meaning it would be worth 10 million yen. So convert that to whatever your currency is, but like, at least where I live, 1/10 of that, because you'd have to divide that 10 million, divide that by 10 for each party member, that would not be enough to live prosperously for a whole year. I guess the six-face world just has a better bang for your buck than we do. God, inflation, shrinkflation. You guys have heard of shrinkflation? It's a real thing. It sounds stupid. Because it is, it's stupid. But there were 2 points of passage in the mountain. There were the gorges between the 2 precipices, known respectively as the Red Worm's lower jaw and the Red Worm's upper jaw. These ravines had existed since the Second Human-Demon War, and they were the only paths at the time that were wide enough for soldiers to pass through. Anticipating that, Laplace, during his war, had taken the opportunity to unleash red worms on soldiers that tried. Dead End was heading through the Red Worm's lower jaw, which connected the southern and western regions of the central continent. Once passing through here, they would be officially in the Asura Kingdom. However, they were taking a roundabout way around the mountains, but there was a certain someone who had different ideas. While traveling, Eris would go like, oh, we don't need to take this detour around the thing. We have Rugerd with us. We could cut right through the mountains. And Rugerd laughed and said, oh, don't be ridiculous. But even Rudius had the idea that maybe with Rugerd they could do it, but with that response, the answer was clear. Rugerd was not strong enough. But then Eris crossed her arms and said that, well, Rudius could do it then. And Rudius like, what? No, I cannot. But according to Eris, Ghislaine had killed a red worm before, although it was alone and she was in a party of 5 and 2 of them died, so yeah, I don't know if Rudius could take one on all on his own. But Rudius mentions that besides that, there's still a difference in strength between a straggler and the ones flying in the skies, and Ruijerd agrees. He says that only the strongest of these 7 great powers could take on a whole pack of red worm dragons, and even says that the sword god Gal and the north god Alec would have to turn back halfway through. As it turns out, unlike king dragons who have flocks of only a few worms, and black worms who don't form any flocks at all, red worms have flocks in like hundreds. But Ruijerd says that Gal and Alec's stamina would likely wear out halfway through, and it's not like you could just sleep with dragons around. That said though, Laplace commanded the king of the red worm dragons, so those ranked in the higher portions of these 7 great powers could probably pass through with no problem. But Ruijerd goes like, well, back in my day, even the weakest of these 7 great powers could easily pass through the red worm's territory undisturbed. And Ruijerd is such a boomer, but he's so right. I'm sure that they were much stronger back then. Kids these days, they're just way too soft. But the next day, while preparing a meal for Ruijerd and Eris, Rudius was thinking about Hitogami, specifically about what happened back in the Shrone Kingdom. It felt as though things were going a little too well for him. It almost seemed like that not only Hitogami could see the future, but he could change it as well. Like when he decided to bring the Ruijerd figure with him to the kingdom. That was the only reason why Zenoba went to see Rudius. But then again, it's likely that Ginger would have still lured Zenoba into meeting Rudius anyway. And likely he still would have brought the Roxy figure, gave him the same speech, and Rudius would have still pointed out the mole that he had removed. But what if he used his real name with Aisha, alone at the inn with her perverted brother? If she was Aisha, she'd fear for her chastity. Aisha was very clever and was trying to get a letter sent, so she'd probably steal his money and make a run for it. From there, Rudius would have to search for her, and as soon as they knew that she was missing, he'd lose all composure, and without thinking about the consequences, he'd blast magic into the air and try to make contact with Ruijerd. He'd tell him that he found Aisha, but she ran away, and he'd ask if they could help her. And since Ruijerd was kind to children, she would surely trust Ruijerd. And so the more Rudius thought about it, the more it seemed like that Hitogami's advice was meant to kind of just ensure things turned out the same way no matter what Rudius did. And that's probably happening even right now. Even if Rudius didn't decide to trust Ruijerd and accept his help, it's likely that he'd still wind up traveling with him anyway. No matter what demon eye Rudius would have chosen from Kishiriko's arsenal, he still would have been captured by the Doldia tribe and sent to the Great Forest. It really seemed like Hitogami was taking a lot into consideration when he gave Rudius advice. And so he thinks maybe he can trust Hitogami. However, despite that, his motives are still unclear. If he could just figure out what Hitogami wants, maybe Rudius can be more honest with him. But as Rudius was thinking that, Ruijerd and Eris were sparring, and they stopped. And Rudius gave her a towel, she wipes herself down, which she apparently used to completely strip down to her underwear to clean herself, but because Rudius was such a pervert, she now has to wipe down all the sweat with this clothes still on, and so it's not really helping because the clothes are just sweaty anyway, and so poor Eris, I guess. Rudius is just a menace. But Rudius thought about their fighting, and more specifically how much Eris has improved. Before, just about a year ago, he could probably easily beat her, and even, in his words, pull her panties down in the midst of combat. But now? No way. Sure, if he used all of his mana and used the Demon Eye, it would be close, but he'd probably come out on top. And of course, he would win if they fought at a distance. But that's basically just cheating. The point is, Eris is definitely stronger than him now, and she isn't afraid to get blood on herself like he is. And for some reason, despite being reincarnated, Rudius kind of retained the stamina and physical prowess of someone from the previous world. Meanwhile, Eris was above and beyond, and the quality and quantity of her hard work put him to complete shame. And it's likely that it's not a biological difference. Both Eris and Rudius came from powerful parents and grandparents. But it's clear that Eris cares just so much more. She puts her entire heart and soul into training while, meanwhile, just a few years ago, he was ready to give up learning magic just to be with some elf chick. On the other hand, Eris would learn magic just to be with Rudius. Their motivations are far too different, and that's why there's a difference in power. Once Rudius has something to fight for, I guess, then he would go all out. But Ruijerd calls Eris a warrior, and now she is an adult, but Rudius is kind of confused. Why not a sword fighter? Why is she a warrior specifically? But the conversation from there kind of goes word for word how it does in the anime, and when night fell and when Eris went to sleep, Rudius asks why Ruijerd said that to Eris, why he called her a warrior now. And he says that it's because no matter how much time passes, Rudius still keeps treating Eris like a child. Sure, in Rudius' mind, he's 47 and Eris is 15, so yes, she is a child to him. But even still, when he thought about it, her body has developed, but so has her mind. She stopped picking on fights with strangers. Her wild tendencies haven't completely gone away, but the frequency of her outbursts has completely decreased. She was certainly in the process from going from a child to an adult. Rudius thought about it, and Rugert says that it's alright if he doesn't completely understand. For some reason, Rudius had a bad feeling about this. It felt kind of like a final conversation a character would have on a TV show before they get killed off. And just as precaution, Rudius gave Rugert a gold coin to put in his breast pocket. Although he didn't really have one, so he kind of just tucked it into the seam of his something close to his breast. Rugert asks what it's for, and Rudius says that it's a good luck charm. Now, a few days later, Dead End reached the entrance to the Asura Kingdom, the Red Worm's lower jaw. A total of 4 months have passed since we set out from the Sarone Kingdom, meaning that it should be about K420-ish. I'm not exactly sure what month we're in. We might be in K421 if Eris has an October birthday, but I don't know for sure. But Rudius then goes on into a monologue like he does in the anime, and so here's kind of a shortened version of it. When bad things happen, they happen quickly. Specifically, bad things happened when you least expect them. There's something else I had yet to realize, and that was how harsh this world really was, how easily people died. No matter who a person was, death could come in an instant. There were no exceptions to that. It would take me a long time, but eventually I would come to understand death as a phenomenon that abruptly robbed me of those closest to me. If I had known this back then, I wouldn't need to lament so deeply now. If only I had been more serious about getting stronger, strong enough that I wouldn't be defeated by anyone. After what happened, I couldn't but be consumed by regrets, wishing I'd walked a slightly different path. There was one thing I could say though. Eris never failed to impress me. Now, I'm not gonna lie, don't know why he goes into a monologue like this here. It doesn't really, no one dies. But I guess he's kind of just generalizing that death is coming. And yeah, people die when they are killed. Except for Rudius, I guess. But anyway, now the second turning point happened. And so, to be honest, there's not really much different from what I've already talked about before. It kind of goes similar to the manga and the anime. And so I'll kind of just go over the events a little bit more quickly. Dead End arrives at the Red Worm's lower jaw, and it's described as a ravine with a path cut directly through the mountains, similar to the Holy Sword Highway. But it wasn't really as straight as it was. Although the path didn't split or fork at all. This was a territory between country borders and wasn't claimed by anyone. Once you passed through it, you would be in the Asura Kingdom. And so the gang was in high spirits, sensing an end to their journey. They were a little anxious because they didn't exactly know how much their homeland has changed. They were a little anxious because they didn't really know how much their homeland has changed, but they felt a sense of accomplishment. You could say they let their guard down. As they walked through the lower jaw, they came across Orsted and Nanahoshi. Of course, Orsted had quite the appearance with his white hair and white cloak, and his Sanpaku eyes, but it was Nanahoshi that really caught Rudius' eye. Her black hair, which is more accurately described as a dark brown ashen color. He notes that he doesn't really remember people by their hair color, but considering that he's never seen someone with black hair yet, it stood out. And another thing that stood out was her pure white mask. It didn't have any sort of design on it, so it didn't really seem like something she'd wear for fashion purposes. Orsted then talked to Rugert, asking if he's a supered, and with a shaken voice, he tells Rudius and Eris to not move a muscle. Rugert's face was even more pale than it normally was, and Eris was gripping her sword so tightly that her hands were white. Orsted kind of composed himself and approached them so casually, and so it was really strange to Rudius how terrified Eris and Rugert were. This guy didn't really seem like he was giving off any evil intentions or anything. But Rudius looked at Orsted with his demon eye, and he could see him split into multiple images, and there were so many that he couldn't even see an exact outline of Orsted's body. Orsted then pieced together the situation, figuring that Rugert is helping these children find their way back home, all as though he was kind of all-knowing. He spoke to both Eris and Rugert as though he knew them. Despite the flatness in his voice, Orsted came across quite friendly, actually. There's a quality to it that made him sound happy, as though he was reuniting with old friends. Understanding the tension, Orsted says that he'll stay out of their way, and that they'll know who he is, eventually. Now Orsted is about to leave when Rudius talks to him, and they give each other their names. Rudius asks how he knows Ruijerd and Eris, but he says that he doesn't yet. And Orsted says that Paul shouldn't have a son, only 2 daughters, and Orsted realizes that Rudius doesn't fear him like the other 2 do. And then Rudius asks if he knows anything about the displacement incident, and Orsted simply says, "I don't." And despite the friendly attitude towards Eris and Ruijerd, it felt as though Orsted was being cautious of Rudius. He was being more distant with him than he was with the other 2, and Rudius then started to apologize for stopping him, but then gets interrupted by Orsted and asks if he knows the name Hitogami. Rudius says that he does, and in an instant his vision changed. Orsted's hand is going to spear right through his chest. It was so fast as though he were teleporting. A second was just far too short for him to see in the future. The vision suddenly disappeared when Ruijerd wedged himself in between Rudius and Orsted. Rudius was sent backwards as Orsted goes, "Ah, so that's it. You're one of Hitogami's apostles." And Ruijerd and Orsted have their match, and it was over in a matter of less than 10 seconds. Ruijerd would attack Orsted, and Orsted would purposefully keep himself within range of his attacks, simply deflecting them like they were nothing. It's not like Orsted is moving faster than Ruijerd or anything. I mean, he could if he wanted to, but compared to Ruijerd's 500 years of skill, Orsted simply had more. Every time Ruijerd attacked and moved, his balance suffered slightly, and each attack he tried to launch was stalled. Orsted was clearly drawing Ruijerd into a trap and was moving as little as possible, yet at the fastest speed possible. If there were a perfect combat strategy put into practice, this would be it. He was like min-maxing every move he made to perfectly take down Ruijerd. There was nothing Ruijerd could even do to counter this. First, Orsted hit him in the solar plexus, then he grazed the top of his chin, and he finally launched a fist that slammed into his temple. Ruijerd rolled twice across the ground before he stopped moving entirely. Orsted possibly could have killed Ruijerd with that third punch if he wanted to, but he didn't. From there, Eris came charging without thinking of a defense and tried to attack Orsted, but he just said, "Secret technique, flow." And all he did was gently stop her sword with the palm of his hand, and that was enough to send her spinning through the air until she hit a wall and collapsed. She flew through the air as though she was just hit with a saint's ultimate technique. And that's just it. Paul had used a similar move on Rudius back in the day. It was a water god style technique, although Orsted's execution was even more polished than Paul's had ever been. And so at this point, we have seen 2 of the 3 secret techniques for the sword styles. The sword god style secret technique, although I don't know, are there multiple secret techniques? There might be, but we've seen the sword god style long sword of light, and now we've seen the water god style flow, which I believe flow is a regular move as well, but Orsted I guess is just using like the mastered version of it. But we have still yet to see the North God's secret technique, or one of their secret techniques if there are multiple. And now after Rudius seeing his companions get defeated in mere moments, all he could see was a vision of his own demise. He saw that in just 1 second from now, Rudius would have all of his vital points destroyed. His head, throat, heart, and lungs, he watched as though each one of those were crushed. Yet at the same time, he saw a vision of Orsted just standing there, unmoving. If the vision was true, then in a second from now, there'd be 5 of him. Then, in an instant, Orsted slid forward, defying the laws of physics, and in an instant, he was right before Rudius. And suddenly, like an animation without frames, just then, 6 of Rudius's ribs were completely fractured simultaneously. There was an impact, but it was different from the kind of attack that would send you flying. In that same instant, like at the same time, Rudius felt another pressure of attack from behind, and that is when his lungs were crushed. And I could attempt to power scale this just to see how fast Orsted would have to move for this, but he's just strong. He's just really, really strong. I think that is my official power scaling judgment. Dude's fast. Like, Orsted is just so fast that he's able to be in 2 places at once. 3, 5 places, I guess. He can be in 5 places at once. That's ridiculous. But Orsted tells Rudius to send a message to Hitogami that he'll kill him, and he leaves. And Rudius takes this opportunity to form a stone cannon. Not any stronger magic that he had at his disposal for whatever reason. And he makes a stone cannon harder and faster than he's ever done before. And he made it spin so fast that it glows and burns on the spot. Again, if I knew physics, I would explain this feat better. But basically, he'd have to heat the stone to at least 800 Kelvin to make it glow like that. To make something burn from sheer movement, I've seen it takes over 500 meters per second to achieve that. Now, how do I convert that to rotations? No idea. Again, it's just really, really fast and really strong. But Rudius then launches the stone cannon, and Orsted turns around and just punches it. And he made it shatter with the sound of crinkling metal. Orsted looked at his fist and noticed the skin was peeled slightly. This is really like a Thanos like all that for a drop of blood, right? But this is Mushoku Tensei did it first. That's all I'm saying. Rudius then forced air into his lungs with the wind magic, I guess, going like, and then he choked violently, because of course he did. And Orsted wondered why Rudius doesn't just heal his lungs if he can do silent spellcasting, but then Rudius is about to fire a fireball in his right hand, but Orsted uses his disturb magic and seals it. It doesn't do anything flashy like it does in the manga, but it appears that the magic functions similarly to the magic barrier that Rudius was in a little bit ago. And it kind of just nullifies, he can extrude magic from his hand, but it can't form anything. But then with his left hand, Rudius conjured a shockwave to create some distance between him and Orsted. At first, Orsted thought that Rudius had nullified his disturb magic, but he realized that he's using not just silent spellcasting, but he's able to use multiple schools of magic simultaneously. Orsted then snapped his fingers and a window of about 50 centimeters formed in the air with gorgeous dragon-shaped ornaments on it. Rudius focused on launching a fireball stronger than he'd ever done before and pictured a nuclear explosion within his head. He didn't even mind the fact that Eris or Ruijerd could be caught in it. He already lost his ability to think. Orsted opens up the front worm gate and the mana from Rudius' left hand is swallowed. The window frame cracked and splintered and an explosion was triggered close to Orsted. It was far less powerful than Rudius had intended it to be, and so he was easily able to avoid it. Orsted notes that a front worm gate at that size couldn't contain his mana, and he says that he's on the same level as Laplace. But he is Hitogami's apostle after all, so that's why Rudius is this strong, or that's why Orsted thinks Rudius is that strong. But Orsted thinks that Rudius is lulling him into letting his guard down by not healing his lungs. But he soon realizes that Rudius simply can't heal himself without an incantation. Without the ability to use magic from his hands, and his legs not listening to him, Rudius tries to use the voice magic that he learned from the Doldia village, but all he could muster was just a hoarse cry as he spit out blood. And confused, Orsted is like, just mana? What are you trying to do, boy? And so ignoring whatever Rudius is trying to do, Orsted has had enough and stabbed Rudius in the chest, piercing his body with his hand. Full of regrets, Rudius collapses to the ground as Eris, who can't move, cries out, begging for anyone to save Rudius. Orsted calls Nanahoshi to leave, but she suggests that it might be better to keep Rudius alive. And just then, Rudius lost consciousness and woke up in the void. He and Hitogami have a chat about Orsted and his 4 curses, 2 of which is the curse of fear and hatred, and whatever the other curse is that doesn't allow Hitogami to see him. Hitogami mentions that it's the same curse that Laplace had, which he then transferred to the spears of the Superds. Rudius was like, okay, why didn't you tell me that earlier? But Hitogami said that, if you weren't like so much of a dick to me earlier, I would have been able to tell you. But he also notes that despite the technique god being number 1 of the 7 great powers, Orsted, the dragon god, who is number 2, would come out on top if they went all out. And Rudius thinks back about his life, and he thinks that maybe even he and Hitogami could have become friends if he never died. And then Hitogami says, "You're not dead." And then Rudius wakes up. Cradled by Eris, she explains that Nanahoshi convinced Orsted to heal Rudius, and it made Rudius realize that Hitogami wasn't lying when he said that Orsted had access to every single skill and technique in the world. Rudius then turned his face inward to Eris's body and hugged her waist. Despite basically dying, for whatever reason, he was still full of energy. She then punches him on the head before pulling his head to her chest, and she hugs it. He could hear the pounding of her heart from deep within, and from above came the faint sound of sobs. She was quietly crying and said, "Oh, thank God." And Rudius then reached up and patted her on the back. Now that was quite an episode. Goddamn, that was a lot. But yeah, I guess the only thing really to note here is Nanahoshi. We've already heard about her kind of in the light novel. There's a couple chapters there, I believe it's the end of volume 5, is a short story, like a bonus extra chapter about dragon meat, Nanahoshi style, where the gang is in the King Dragon realm and they have dinner. They have some kind of meal. I think it's noon, and they eat at Randolph the Death God's restaurant. And the food served there was dragon meat Nanahoshi style, and it was literally just like a Japanese meal. So there's something going on with Nanahoshi. And the thoughts that Rudius had about Hitogami, like predicting the future, almost seeing the future, being able to manipulate it is really interesting because there is something called fate in the universe, right? It's an actual force in the world. And so part of it is Hitogami like just being like a mastermind and being able to plan things perfectly. But it's also like fate is just guiding Rudius to one way. So no matter what he does, if he messes up this thing or does this thing incorrectly, it should still guide him to where he needs to be. And that whole thing kind of got me thinking, like, what would have happened if Rudius never spoke to Orsted and they just went their separate ways? And I definitely want to make a few videos about that, a good old what if series, because I think that's so fascinating. There's so much there. But anyway, I don't know. What do you guys think about the episode? Did you enjoy it? Did you not? What about my review? How do you like that? Give it a like if you did, or even if you didn't, give it a like, because I can't see the dislikes anymore. So you'll have to like the video in order to like really let me see a number, right? But ring bell, subscribe, watch later. Goodbye.